I don't know about y'all, but it seems like the Genshin Impact community has been debating who are the top 5 DPS. I feel like everyone already knows that MiHoYo is number 1, but it seems like most people can't actually answer who the rest are, since the ranking is always extremely subjective. So in this video, I'll be going over the top 5 DPS before nod-krai to finally answer the question, who are the top 5 DPS in Genshin Impact? The rubric or conditions that I'll be using to decide which DPS is the best is their team damage and the number of teams they're viable in, meaning that I'll rank them based on their team efficiency and versatility, since Genshin Impact is a team game after all. Before starting off the official ranking, I want to give some honorable mentions to some DPS who arguably have the potential to be on this list, but who in my opinion are not. Starting off with the first honorable mention, Mualani. Mualani is an incredibly powerful character whose DPS can even be higher than Yuvilet's DPS, but to actually reach this DPS in practice is extremely difficult, meaning that for a lot of people, doing this consistently is just straight up impossible, since there are many times where the enemies won't be suited for her single target nuke playstyle, making it even harder to pull off. Mualani is also restricted to pretty much one elemental reaction based team, that being vaporized teams. Thus, her versatility is abysmal and her DPS, although high, is extremely inconsistent in practice. For another honorable mention, we've got Kenichi. Kenichi does a tremendous amount of damage, but his DPS just isn't on par with the characters on this list. He's definitely still viable, but he's not anything insane. Not to mention, he too is restricted to one elemental reaction based team, that being a burning team. For another honorable mention, we've got Chaska, whose DPS also isn't anything that impressive compared to some of the characters on this list, but whose DPS is still definitely powerful enough to be viable. Not only that, but her versatility is truly off the charts. You can pretty much run her on a team with any Hydro, Cryo, Electra, or Pyro characters and reach incredibly powerful DPS numbers. Anyways, with the honorable mentions out of the way, we'll be starting off with the 5th best DPS in Genshin Impact, Arlecchino, the 4th of the Fatui Harbingers. Arlecchino is an incredibly powerful and flexible character that can be placed in a myriad of teams. Being a Pyro character, she can be played in melt comps, vape comps, overload comps, mono pyro comps, or simply hyper carry comps. Not only that, but she has a myriad of teammates like powerful generalists, free-to-play characters, elemental applicators, or niche supports. For her melt and vape teams, she can be ran with hydro or cryo applicators like Yelan, who gives her a 50% damage stout boost, Qingchuo, who gives her interruption resistance for her normal attacks, Kea, or even Furina and or Escoffier, since they both have good hydro and cryo application that helps Arlecchino in her vape and melt teams. Not only that, but both Furina and Escoffier synergize with each other extremely well, so running them together would be viable. Arlecchino can also be ran with Silali, who has a far better cryo application than Escoffier, and who actually reduces pyro resistance without having any restrictions on it. For her overload teams, she has Chevreuse, who allows her to have this playstyle because of her insane buffs, Bennett because of his insane attack, and Fischl because of her sub DPS damage and Electro application, which comes in handy when triggering Chevreuse's passives. For her mono pyro teams, she can be ran with Dea, since the interruption resistance she gives with her skill comes in handy, since Arlecchino does a majority of her damage through normal attacks. Dea can even be ran with the tenacity set so that she can increase the attack of teammates by 20%. Arlecchino can also be ran with Changling, since her ultimate damage is insane, and with Bennett, since even though he can't heal her, his attack buff is still insane. When it comes to her DPS sadly is nowhere near the characters higher on this list. Some may even argue that characters like Kenichi and Mualani should be ranked 5th because their DPS cap is higher, but because Arlecchino's versatility is so good, whereas Kenichi once again is stuck to burning and Mualani to vaporized base teams, that's why Arlecchino is able to make it to 5th place. Onto the 4th best DPS in Genshin Impact. This might come as a shock considering her DPS is definitely the 2nd best in the game. In 4th place, we've got Skirk. Although Skirk can do a lot of damage in her best teams are typically only composed of a small amount of 5-star Hydro or Cryo characters, which if you put on the same team as say Nuvilet, their DPS numbers are extremely similar, meaning that typically even on her best teams, Skirk isn't even the one doing the majority of the damage. And again, this ranking is based off of not only efficiency but also versatility as well, meaning that if this ranking was about solely DPS numbers, then yes, Skirk would be ranked way higher, but because it's not, Skirk unfortunately will be ranked in the 4th place simply because her best teams are limited to 5-star characters. Funny thing is, you can even run both her and Neuvillette on the same team and do a ton more damage, since Skirk does have an alternative nuke DPS playstyle, meaning that technically her versatility allows her to be slightly better, but ironically on a Neuvillette team. Now valid, her nuke DPS playstyle can have higher DPS than Neuvillette's DPS on teams where you put Skirk with Ryosli or Skirk with Ayaka as well, and I wouldn't even be surprised if future Cryo or Hydro DPS characters would be extremely viable on her best teams. But again, these teams would always require 5-star Hydro and Cryo characters, so regardless, relative to every other character on this list's versatility, Skirk just doesn't have anywhere near enough of it. Onto the 3rd character on this list, I feel like it's pretty obvious who's next, since I've been comparing them to Skirk. For the 3rd character, we've got Neuvillette. Although Neuvillette's DPS isn't as great as it once was, his DPS is still incredible, even compared to Skirk. Neuvillette's versatility, however, is off the charts. You can run him in teams that nobody would think of running him with and still reach viable DPS. For example, while doing some personal testing, I ran Neuvillette in an odd team comp. I ran Neuvillette with Raiden Shogun, Pyro MC, and Baiju, and his DPS was only 25% lower than his ideal team of Escoffier, Furina, and Skirk. Whereas with Skirk, I tried doing the same thing and ran her with Kazuha, Zhongli, and Mavuika, and who would have guessed, her DPS was more than 60% lower than one of her ideal teams, that being with Escoffier, Furina, and Neuvillette. Now, I'm not a complete Genshin Impact theory crafter with a master's degree in theory crafting, but this experiment, to me at least, shows how much more versatile Neuvillette is than Skirk. Not only that, but I also did an experiment with both of them to see how good their individual DPS was. I ran Neuvillette with Collei, Toma, and Satos, all at like level 30 and no artifacts. I only used them to activate Neuvillette's talents. Turns out, doing this reduces his team DPS by around 50% of what it was with this ideal team of Escoffier, Furina, and Skirk. Then I did the same thing with Skirk, and where I ran a level 70 Diona and Rosaria with a level 80 Ayato who was applying a lot of good sub DPS, but regardless, I ran Skirk with those characters solely so that she can get her passives. The DPS of this team turned out to be pretty much the same as Neuvillette's team, which to me shows that their individual DPS isn't that different from one another, and yet Neuvillette just has much more versatility, not only because of his team options, but because of his AoE capabilities as well. Through testing, I found out that the second that there's more than one enemy on the field, Neuvillette, without a doubt, is absolutely better than Skirk hands down. Now, I know that on the sheets, Skirk's best team's DPS is almost 25% higher than Neuvillette, but again, I'm not saying that that's not the case. I'm just saying that the majority of people won't have those ideal sheets, which wouldn't lead to a 33% loss in DPS like with Neuvillette, but a 60% DPS loss instead most of the time. Not only that, but a lot of the time enemy formations will have more than one enemy, meaning that Neuvillette's AoE capabilities will simply make him better. So to me, he's the better DPS because of his versatility and his DPS only theoretically being 25% lower than Skirk. Anyway, with those comparisons out of the way, Neuvillette is one of, if not the most versatile character in the game, simply because he's Hydro. What this means is that because the Hydro element has so many elemental reactions like Vape, Freeze, Bloom, Hyper Bloom, Burgeon, and Electrocharge, Neuvillette can be run in a myriad of elemental reaction based teams as well as a traditional Hyper Carry team comp. For Vape team comps, he can be ran with any powerful Pyro sub DPS character like Changling and Mavuika, so that both of them can do all the Vapes. For Freeze teams, obviously these teams aren't actually based off of the elemental reaction, since bosses can't be frozen, but rather the teammates like Escoffier, Silali, Lali and Furina. For Bloom, he can be ran with practically any Dendro applicator ever. For Hyper Bloom, he can be ran with practically every Electro character ever, and for Burgeon, the same thing, but this time it's practically every Pyro character ever. And for Electro Charge, Fischl and Auroron are pretty good with him, although for Aoife and Mizuki, he isn't that good since he acts as an on-field DPS. Not only that, but he also doesn't really synergize too well with crystallized base teams, since most of them scale off of defense and or attack, while Nuvilet's scales off of HP, which is really his only other restriction other than being stuck as being an on-field DPS. He can even be ran in a hyper carry setting with traditional generalist supports like Kazuha, Zhongli, Cylonen, or most importantly, Furina, who he synergizes perfectly with. Other than only being able to be an on-field DPS and an HP scaler, he pretty much has no other restriction that ruins his versatility. Thus, as the king of versatility and as an extremely good main DPS, Nuvilet is ranked in 3rd place. Onto the second best DPS in Genshin Impact, we have Verisa. Verisa is pretty similar to Skirk in terms of damage, but a lot more similar in Nuvilet in terms of versatility. Prior to the release of Skirk, Verisa had the second best DPS in the entire game, meaning that now her DPS is now the only 3rd best in the game. But that's fine, because relative to the second highest DPS in the game, her versatility is off the charts. She can be ran in overload teams with Chevreuse, who enables this playstyle for her, and can also be practically run with any other off-field Electro and Pyro characters like Fischl, Changling, Bennett, Kojosara, Pyro MC, or Mavuika, since Verisa is an on-field DPS who can really only work with other sub-DPS or nuke DPS like Mavuika, in the same sense that Nuvilet works with Skirk's nuke playstyle. She can also be ran in Electro Charge teams with practically any off-field Hydro and Electro characters like Auroron, Fischl, Furina, Yelan, or Jingzhuo, or in Aggravate teams with any off-field Dendro applicator like Baizhu and Nahida. She could also work in a Hyper Bloom team, but she isn't as efficient as other options like Raiden or Kuki Shinobu. Also, because of her Nightsoul aligned attacks, she could also work as a Nightsoul generator in a Mavuika team like I mentioned for her overload teams. Obviously, she can also work in a standard hypercarry team with Furina and Xianyun as well as Ayansan, since Furina is able to provide a good amount of damage dealt with Xianyun's healing, who also buffs Verisa's plunge attack damage. As you can see, not only does Verisa have the 3rd highest DPS in the game, but she also has far more versatility than the 2nd highest DPS in the game. Thus, Verisa will be ranked as the 2nd best DPS in Genshin Impact. For the best DPS in Genshin Impact, we obviously have Mavuika. In the same sense that Nuvilet's versatility is off the charts because he's Hydro, Mavuika's DPS is off the charts because she's a Pyro character. Not only that, but her versatility is pretty much as good as Verisa, the 2nd best DPS in the game. She can be ran in melt teams with Silali, Escoffier, Diona, etc., where her damage is practically doubled. Vaporized teams with Furina, Jingzhuo, Yelan, etc., where her damage is amplified by 50%. Overload teams with Chevreuse and any other Pyro or Electro character. Burning teams with Kinich and Emily, and Burgeon teams with any Dendro applicator and Hydro applicator. Not to mention, Mavuika can be played in a variety of playstyles unlike Nuvilet, Verisa, or Arlecchino, who can only be played as a main DPS. Mavuika can be played as either a main DPS with supports, off-field applicators, and or sub-DPS, and as a dual DPS with another DPS like Ryosli, Kinich, or even Verisa and Nuvilet. Now, although she does have the major restriction of requiring Nightsoul aligned characters, I honestly feel like we have enough characters that can help her with that. Ayansan, one of her best supports, Auroron, a good sub-DPS and Electro applicator which comes in handy for overload teams, and Pyro MC, a good support and Pyro applicator, are all good examples of free-to-play friendly characters that are 100% viable with her. Not only that, but again, she can easily work well with Verisa on an overload team and with Kinich on a burning team, which is slightly ironic because Verisa's best teams often include Mavuika. Also, her best supports, aka Cylonen and Silali, are in isn't just extremely good with her, but with a ton of other units as well, meaning that chances are the majority of people already have them, similar to the sense that most people always assume that the majority of people have Furina for the same reasons. And although this logic would somewhat actually justify the restrictiveness of a Skirk team, it actually doesn't, since again, Skirk's DPS is halved when played with 4 stars, while Mavuika's damage is only slightly nerfed in comparison to Skirk. For if you were to play her with Ayansan, Bennett, and Kazuha rather than with Cylone, Silali, and Ayansan, the damage difference wouldn't be as absurd as Skirk's. Regardless, if you have differing opinions, please leave them down in the comments below. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. Goodbye.